Good morning, everyone. I hope you are well. And we have a new book for Head Teacher Reads. We are delving into the words of Padraig Kenny, and we are going to be reading Tin. I have chosen this book for two reasons. One, because it is fabulous. It's an amazing book, and you will, I know you will enjoy it as you come on the twists and turns with me. And secondly, because it is the book which I am the expert for as part of our 100 books. Hopefully by now you will have had a look into our new 100 book website. Do have a look at that. The links were on Friday's Head Teacher Update. And then you'll be able to see an extract from this book, which I'm reading, and also an extract from all 100 of our books by the staff who are the experts. So, as a little introduction before we get into chapter 1, we first of all find the laws of mechanics. Number 1, only licensed and registered engineers have the legal right to animate mechanicals. Point 2, it is forbidden to confer life and sentience upon any raw material which conforms to the standard agreed dimensions of an adult or proper human being. Point 3, all mechanical devices conferred with life must be so created using the principles of basic propulsion and the mechanism of glyphs. And point 4, it is strictly forbidden to confer life upon a mechanical using the principles of refined propulsion, otherwise known as ensoulment. So with those 4 points firmly embedded in our mind, let's kick on with chapter 1. Snow was falling from the night sky, and all the world was cold and hushed, except for the regular metallic squeaking of Jack's joints. Christopher glanced at Jack, but the mechanical looked straight ahead, oblivious to the sound. Absalom was walking a few feet in front, his thin black coat billowing around him. Squeak, squeak. Christopher willed the sound to stop. Squeak, squeak. Absalom wheeled around, raising his tall, spidery frame up to its full height. I thought I told you to oil him before we left the yard, he said, glaring down at Christopher. I did, Mr. Absalom. The truth was, in all the panic of their hurried departure, Christopher had completely forgotten to oil Jack's joints. Absalom scowled at him. He did. He even checked me for loose rivets, said Jack. Fix your hair, said Absalom, flapping his hand at Jack, who pulled down the edges of his wig and grinned at Christopher. Christopher smiled weakly in response. Ever since Absalom had informed them that there might be the possibility of an actual sale in Aylesbury, he'd felt an awful, cold, sinking sensation in his chest. Absalom hadn't made a real sale in quite a long time, except for his scarecrows, which were frankly embarrassing concoctions. The most recent had walked out of its field and was found 3 months later, 10 miles away, face down in a river. By this time, Absalom had told them the stars were aligning. A sale was most definitely on the cards, and after a bit of gleeful capering around his office, he told Jack to replace his regular red hair with a brown wig, because nobody buys gingers, awfully sickly-looking things. Jack didn't mind. He was secretly delighted at the possibility of being sold, although Jack, being Jack, he was too hard-headed to show it. Even so, Christopher had caught him grinning to himself on the way over to the truck. Christopher stole another anxious glance at Jack as they walked along the street. He was grinning to himself again, but this time he noticed Christopher watching. Christopher looked away quickly. What's wrong? Said Jack. Nothing, Christopher replied. Absalom's mood was improving. He looked up in amazement at the falling snow. Beautiful. I couldn't have planned it better if I'd arranged it myself. He signalled them to stop halfway along a row of red brick houses, clasped his hands together and grinned at the two boys. Here we are, so. Number 10 is the abode we require. Remember what we practiced, Jack? Yes, Mr. Absalom. Christopher? Yes, Mr. Absalom. Stand up straight, look smart. Remember, you're assistant to the greatest engineer in all of Britain. Yes, Mr. Absalom. The door they faced was dark green with a dull brass knocker. Absalom straightened himself up, took the knocker and gave it 3 confident raps. He spoke to the boys without looking at them. Smile, lads. There were a few moments of silence, broken only by the soft fizz of falling snow. Then the sound of a bolt being thrown back. The door opened, and Absalom smiled his broadest smile. A man in his 30s with a curly mop of hair poked his head out. Yes, he said. Absalom gave a small bow. Mr. Chapman, allow me to introduce myself. I am Mr. Gregory Absalom, a creator of rudimentaries, mannequins, mechanicals, and machines of varying sentience, variety, and vivacity. He snapped his wrist, and a business card appeared in his hand. Before Mr. Chapman knew what was happening, he'd taken the card and was looking at it with a dazed expression. He looked up, his head bobbing, eyes blinking, as if he'd just been punched. I'm sorry, what's this about? Absalom clasped his hands together in a gesture of prayer and took on a sombre cast. Word has reached me, sir, of your personal tragedy. Please accept my sincerest condolences, late though they may be. The man's face whitened. Who told you? How is that any of your... Who told you? He demanded. Christopher felt suddenly nervous. He tried to catch Absalom's eye, but the engineer was too busy fixing the man with a look that was both sympathetic and predatory. I have friends in the village, Mr. Chapman. They came to me out of the kindness of their hearts, and they told me of your predicament. Mr. Chapman looked at him with eyes wide, resting his hand on the frame of the door as if he were trying to steady himself. How long has it been, Mr. Chapman? Asked Absalom. His head tilted, eyes soft and moist with well-practised compassion. Mr. Chapman trembled for a moment. 6 weeks, he said, his voice suddenly hoarse with grief. And he was your only child? Mr. Chapman nodded. Christopher felt blazing hot spots on his forehead and cheeks. He'd presumed that this was just a normal sale. He hadn't realised what the circumstances were, and now he was furious that Absalom was trying to take advantage of this man. He was about to step forward and say something, but Absalom, without even looking at him, deftly raised his right hand and put just enough pressure on his chest to halt him in his tracks. Very sad indeed, said Absalom, sighing and shaking his head. Christopher saw the sly glimmer in his eyes. What would you say, sir, if I told you I could alleviate your pain and grief in some small measure? Mr. Chapman's eyes grew wide and defenceless. Christopher knew the poor man was now right where Absalom wanted him. Absalom flourished theatrically in Jack's direction. May I present a top-of-the-range model, one of my finest creations, if I may be so bold. Jack stepped forward and smiled at Mr. Chapman. He tilted his head, just as Absalom had taught him, and gave Mr. Chapman a hopeful, humble look. Christopher felt sick. Jack, we call him. But of course, his appellation is just a movable feast. Should you make the decision to purchase, he comes complete with all the attributes of a boy his apparent age. A sense of fun. Jack smiled and gave a little jig, while he rocked his elbows back and forth like a musical hall comedian. An intelligence far beyond that of his contemporaries. Jack put his hand to his chin and squinted sagely into the sky. 395 times 672 is 265,440. Along with a splendid mobility and articulation. Jack did a cartwheel followed by a handstand. His joints squeaked, and Absalom took the opportunity to give Christopher a sour look. Christopher glared back at him, and Absalom's expression disappeared as he once again turned and smiled at a stunned Mr. Chapman. As you can see, sir, he is a most estimable model, a miracle of engineering, and I can assure you a most affordable price should you make the decision to purchase. Thomas? Who is that? A voice drifted from inside the house. Who's at the door? There was a long, wintry silence before a woman appeared from behind Mr. Chapman, her hair straggly, her eyes vacant and shadowed with lines of sleeplessness. Who is it, Thomas? What do they want? Mr. Chapman looked anxious. Nothing, Ruth. Go back inside. It's no one. Absalom moved with the whiplash speed of a rattlesnake. Mrs. Chapman, he said as he moved towards the threshold, I was just offering your husband my most sincere condolences. From what I've heard from our mutual friend, your son, William. Christopher saw Mr. Chapman flinch. His wife's hand went to her mouth. Was a most eminent and decent young man. Absalom finished the sentence with a crack in his voice and dabbed at his eyes with the hanky before continuing. I was just showing your husband our latest model, one that I hope might offer a suitable approximation of your son. One indeed that might give some small measure of emotional fulfillment and sense of family at this most auspicious time of year. Jack was walking around on his hands. Mrs. Chapman looked at him with a kind of nervous astonishment. She bent down to have a closer look. Jack flipped back onto his feet and looked at Mrs. Chapman for the first time. He walked towards her, a look of genuine sincerity on his face. This is Jack, Mrs. Chapman, Absalom said gently. He ushered Jack forward by the shoulders. A great hush descended again. In the background, Christopher could hear the low murmur of a mournful wind. Ruth, said Mr. Chapman. His wife didn't seem to hear him. Her head was quivering, and she bent even lower as Jack approached. One of my finest creations, Mrs. Chapman. A very subtle mechanical approximation of humanity, both in form and content. Jack can be a worker, a friend, a companion. Absalom paused as Mrs. Chapman's eyes widened. A son? She gave the smallest of whimpers. Mr. Chapman lowered his head and let out a plaintive, Ruth, please. Jack stepped closer, and Christopher's heart lurched when he saw the look of agonized hope in her eyes. Absalom spread his arms wide. As the snow falls, think on this. How good and proper and right it would be to have a family together at Christmas. The putting up of a tree, the smiles, the anticipation, the scent of orange and spices in the air, the melodious comfort of carols. And who better to share all of this with than one's own progeny? To be together as a family unit, bound by love, by joy, and by the anticipation of a visit from Father Christmas himself. Absalom began to casually fire off his prices, outlining various options for renting or buying. Christopher tried to dampen the hot, sickening anger he felt. He looked at Mrs. Chapman's eyes brimming with tears and hope and pain. Mr. Chapman had his head bowed, as if he'd already surrendered to the inevitable. Absalom's voice was becoming more high-pitched, as if he couldn't quite believe what was about to happen. His nostrils were flaring as if he could smell money about to change hands. The sight filled Christopher with disgust. It took one word to bring it all crashing down. Jack stepped forward and smiled hopefully. Just one word. Mummy, he said. It was as if the snow around Mr. Chapman had suddenly turned into a violent spinning vortex. Christopher had never seen rage like it. No! Mr. Chapman screamed. He kicked Jack full in the chest, and Jack hurtled backwards into the snow, hitting the ground with a metallic clatter. Mr. Chapman pulled his wife inside and slammed the door in Absalom's face. In the silence, the snow hissed down around them. Ooh, told you it was gripping. So there was chapter 1, and tomorrow we'll move on to chapter 2, starting off back in the truck. So hopefully you've enjoyed that, and you will be on your journey with me as we delve into the world of tin and of the wonderful characters that we meet along the way. Have a great day. Bye for now.